For me, the most important thing when you're improvising or taking a solo is having clear and strong ideas and then knowing what to do with those ideas. So developing your ideas in a musical way. It all seems very obvious and simple, and I suppose the kind of things that I'm going to be talking about in this video are quite obvious and simple, yet I hear so many players who struggle to build their solos in a convincing way, and I think it's tempting to think that the answer lies in learning more stuff, so more technique, more theory, more flashy licks, more scales. And that stuff's not unimportant, but what I want to emphasize in this video is that you can start playing better solos right away just by employing and paying attention to some quite simple musical principles. And I also want to stress that this isn't just about improvisation. You might not be playing improvised music. Maybe you're in a band where you just want to write some hooky and catchy solos and guitar parts, in which case all of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is still going to be totally relevant. I'm going to begin by taking a short improvised solo over a backing track, which I'm going to be using throughout this video to demonstrate these concepts. And I'm going to try and keep it really simple. I'm going to be focusing on strong ideas, developing those ideas, good phrasing, good rhythm, and good tone. So let me begin by doing that. I'm in the key of A minor for this video, playing over a very simple 4-chord loop. It's just A minor, F, C, and G, so a very common minor key chord progression. And if you like, you can record yourself playing that chord progression or use a looper pedal, or my backing track is going to be available on my Patreon page to play along to for those of you who are interested in that. And in terms of my note choice, again, I'm keeping things very, very simple. So I'm mostly just playing A minor pentatonic stuff. Occasionally I might throw in some natural minor scale ideas, but for the most part it's very, very simple. I don't want you to get bogged down in scales and note choices with this particular video. It's much more about ideas and how you develop those ideas. I think the most important point I want to make in this video, if you take one thing from this video, then it's the importance of starting with a strong and clear idea. What is a strong and clear idea? That's a little bit harder to define. Obviously it's quite a subjective thing, but for me it's got to be something memorable, and that can either be a melodic idea or a rhythmic idea or a textural thing, just something that is memorable that you can then take and develop, and you can follow that idea like a thread through the rest of your solo. One of the most common things I hear in perhaps less experienced players when they take a solo is just that lack of a defined idea, and they might start their solo with something too complex or just a bit of a noodle. So, you know, go it's just, for a start, that idea is too long and there's no shape to it. I can't remember what I just played. If I can't remember what I just played, then I've got no chance of actually developing that into something interesting. So what I suggest is starting off very simply. Just find a very simple melody, a very simple rhythmic thing. It could just be one note, it could just be a pair of notes, and doing something that's reasonably memorable with it. I'm not saying it has to be some kind of timeless hook or melody, but at least something that you yourself can remember and then you can run with it. So I think in my little improvisation at the start of this video, I just tried to keep it really simple. I think it was just one note or maybe two notes, and I just found a little kind of rhythmic idea. So super simple. It doesn't really get much more simple than that, but at least it's a starting point. I can remember that, and then I can take it somewhere, which is what I'm going to be talking about next. So once you have your initial idea, there are lots of things we can do with it. I'm going to be spending the rest of this video talking about some of the options, and these are really just suggestions. There are no rules, man, when it comes to taking a guitar solo. So these are just some ideas, some devices that I would use when I take a solo. Try them out, see what works for you. And the first idea, very, very obvious one, but super effective. It's the basis of so much music, is just simple repetition. So you have an idea and then you repeat it, and then you possibly repeat it again. And don't be afraid to do that. Again, I think a lot of inexperienced players might think, well, you know, can it really be that simple? I just have an idea and then I repeat it. You know, shouldn't there be more to it than that? Shouldn't I be doing something more complicated? You know, not always. Obviously, you don't want to overdo something like repetition, but sometimes just having the confidence to find a cool idea and then to repeat it, or to repeat it with just some slight variations, can be super effective. So I might just take my little opening idea, maybe something like this. And first option I've got is just to repeat that exactly the same way, once, maybe several times. Because we're dealing with a chord progression here, we've got a 4-chord progression. If I play the same notes over each chord in that chord progression, it could actually be interesting, because the function, the intervals are changing, the relationship of those notes against the chord is changing. So it's not in fact a straight repetition. It feels slightly different to play those same notes over each chord in the chord progression. So that could be one thing to try. Or you know, if that is a bit much, just to repeat it the same way every time, you could repeat it, but just change something slightly, maybe change the rhythm, change the way you articulate some of those notes. So I was perhaps overdoing it slightly there just for the purposes of demonstration, but you know, if you have the courage of your convictions, something like that could really work. And you know, it's not a million miles away from how someone like Neil Young perhaps might start a solo. So sometimes just brutal repetition like that can be super effective. But obviously it is good to move on from just straight repetition like that. And another really useful idea would just be to take your opening idea and then simply play it in a different octave. So take it down an octave, take it up an octave, and suddenly you've got some more mileage out of your initial idea. So that might sound something like this. One of the easiest ways to develop your initial idea is just to add to it slightly. So if you've got your initial strong idea that you can actually remember, then you just repeat it, but maybe add on another note, maybe repeat it again, add on another couple of notes. And this was something I did in my opening solo. I had a little phrase, a little hook, which was something like this. It seems like a fairly catchy kind of a melody. Why don't I develop that by just adding on a couple of extra notes. And then I could do it one more time, but turn it into an even longer phrase. Something along those lines. Actually a very easy thing to do if your initial idea is fairly straightforward and fairly memorable. Again, I want to emphasize that there are no rules here. Of course, there are soloists who do open solos sometimes with things that are quite complicated, and that's something you yourself might want to do for kind of dramatic effect if it fits the musical situation. But more often than not, I think it's easier to get effective results starting from a simple-ish idea and then developing that idea. So along to the backing track, this kind of development of a simple idea might sound something like this. already touched on this a little bit, but rhythm is obviously hugely important, and it's a really useful way of developing your ideas, or else getting more mileage out of an initial idea. One of my favourite things to do is to use rhythmic displacement and to think about where in relation to the beat I'm starting an idea. So a very simple exercise might be to start a phrase on beat 1 and then play the same idea but starting on beat 2 and then perhaps on beat 3 and then on beat 4, and it completely changes the character of the phrase depending on where you start the phrase rhythmically. One of the most common analogies when it comes to talking about soloing is with language, and each musical idea is said to be like a sentence or a phrase, and then you put these sentences together to form paragraphs of an entire solo, and it's a really useful way of thinking about things. And you want your musical ideas or sentences to follow on naturally from one another. You want to say something and then the next sentence it needs to be developing the idea in some way or adding in some new kind of information. Or another common way of thinking about it is to think in terms of call and response or question and answer. So you have some kind of statement and then the next idea is responding to the first idea, and it could be with a similar idea, or it could be with a contrasting idea. There are sort of no rules about exactly what follows on naturally from the initial musical idea. That's something you can experiment with, but it's certainly a very common, very useful way of thinking about your soloing. So for example, a question might go something like this. And then I could have an answer. So there I had my question, and then the answer was a phrase that was very similar. I just varied the last couple of notes. So similar to what I was talking about earlier, repetition with a little bit of variation. Or you could have a question with a contrasting idea as an answer. So perhaps something like this. So there's the question, and then maybe... So a slightly different idea. It did feel like it naturally followed on from the first idea, but it didn't have the same shape. It went up a bit higher, and the note choice was slightly different, but still I think it worked. It's important to think about your phrasing, in particular the length of your phrases. And again, with the language analogy, you can have kind of short, snappy sentences, or you can have quite long, meandering sentences. So I don't know what the equivalent in terms of writers would be. Maybe you'd have Hemingway's prose in contrast with someone who writes kind of long, complex sentences. I don't know, Henry James or someone like that. And you can kind of play around with the length of your phrases, even within a single solo. I think you don't always want to be playing the same length of phrases. You might start with some shorter phrases and then develop into some longer phrases, or vice versa. And I think the precise nature of the phrasing is obviously going to depend on the context. So in particular, the rhythmic feel and the tempo of the kind of musical backdrop that you're playing against. So let me once again play against my backing track, and I'll try and vary my phrase length a little bit. So I might do some 1-bar phrases, then some 2-bar phrases, and then perhaps a longer 4-bar phrase. It's said all the time that the space you leave is as important as the notes themselves, but still I think as guitarists we don't pay enough attention to this, and still solo after solo you hear and it's just this endless stream of boring notes. So this is something to pay particular attention to, and try and construct your solos with these clear phrases and then space between these phrases. And this can be quite a difficult thing to do, because I think we're programmed to think that the guitar solo is our chance to shine, our chance to melt faces and show off all this amazing stuff that we can do. So it does actually take quite a lot of nerve, particularly for more inexperienced players, to actually just relax and leave some space. But it's really important to do that. And yeah, of course there are going to be exceptions. I do actually like some solos which are quite busy, but still I think it's a good strategy to start fairly sparse, have some space, and then gradually get busier as a solo progresses. There are many ways you can manipulate your musical ideas as a way of developing them, and a very common thing to do is to transpose or to sequence your musical ideas. I'm sure you've all heard this kind of thing. Those kind of rock licks like that. It's just a scale sequence. So we've got a very simple idea here. It's just a group of 3 descending notes, and then I'm just playing that same group of 3 notes, but I'm taking it down a pentatonic scale. So I'm starting on a different note each time and going down 3. And there are many of these pentatonic sequence ideas, and they can be very effective, but it doesn't always have to sound quite so scaly and so exercisey. It can work with just about any kind of musical idea. It can work with more melodic kind of material. So another example, if I've got an initial phrase like this, again this is a A minor pentatonic phrase, I can just take that up a bit higher. So you can hear that the phrase has got the same musical shape, but I'm starting each time at a different place in the scale on a different note. This is something that's also useful in a jazz situation, where quite frequently you will be faced with a series of quite quickly changing keys, and then a good strategy might be to take a musical idea and just transpose it, just take that lick and shift it to the new key. So for example, if you've got a 2-5-1 or a series of descending 2-5-1s, perhaps this happens quite commonly in jazz. So I might have a 2-5-1 idea over that. And then say that the chords just move down a tone and we've got another 2-5-1. And I can just take my lick down again. Really just taking exactly the same phrase, just moving it down 2 frets at a time to fit the new key. And you can play exactly the same phrase, you could play some slight variations on that phrase, but it's a very effective and quite an easy way of dealing with potentially tricky chord changes. For those of you interested in the gear that I'm using, the guitar today is my Trent Model 1, and I was an early adopter of these Trent guitars. This is one of the original models. It's very nice to see recently that Elliot Trent is enjoying quite a lot of success with these guitars. It's thoroughly deserved. He's now got quite a few famous types using the Model 1, which is fantastic to see. And today I'm playing the Model 1 through my Fender Princeton, and got a couple of effects pedals down here, overdrive coming from the J Rocket Archer and a little bit of delay from an MXR Carbon copy. That's it for this video. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope that you have a play around with some of these ideas, and I hope that they make some kind of difference to your playing. As usual, there are going to be some extras up on my Patreon page, so I'm going to be tabbing out most of the examples that I've been demonstrating in this video. My backing track is also going to be up there, so check that out if you're interested, and I will see you next time.